welcome to episode 4 of Fair Tips Talks, where we're going to be talking about the dangers posed by non-compliance to the new laws and the guidance that is coming in with regards to trunk. I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by my old buddy by now, Andy Hammam, Olivia Lord, Ben Thomas, and Charlie Barnes. And I'm going to hand over to you guys to introduce yourselves. We have had a slight technical problem on this particular issue. So Olivia, I'll start with you because you've got a wonderful painting behind you rather than the standard background. Would you just like to introduce yourself to anyone out there who doesn't know who you are or who the Athenaeum Hotel is?
Okay, so I'm Olivia. I'm Director of Finance here at the Athenaeum Hotel. I've been here for just over a year, but my background is hotels, mainly 5-star in London. The Athenaeum is a long-established 5-star hotel at the end of Piccadilly.
Lovely, thank you. Andy, our trunk specialist, do you want to just let people know why you are so credible and why you're online here with us today?
Hi, everyone. Andy, I run a consultancy called The Trunk Advisor. I have been advising businesses in hospitality for over 20 years. Anything and everything to do with tips, service charge, trunks, compliance, structuring, and efficiencies.
Lovely, thank you very much. And Ben?
Hi again. Ben, I'm CEO, one of the co-founders of TiPJAR.
Thank you. And Charlie?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so my name is Charlie Barnes and I'm head of the employment legal team at RSM and specialise in particular on issues around pay governance in the leisure and hospitality industry, with a particular focus at the moment on the new tipping legislation.
Okay, fantastic. Let's start off with some discussion about non-compliance. So if we find ourselves in a situation where we're not complying with this new legislation, it's obviously going to become a legal problem for the operator that finds themselves in that situation. What kind of non-compliance are we seeing at the moment? So prior to this legislation coming in, what's the kind of thing that we're seeing? Charlie, maybe you could start us off. That might become a problem once this legislation is active in our industry?
Yeah, I think a couple of challenges that we might see straight away, and quite obvious ones, is that there might be some operators out there who are making certain deductions from tips, which they won't be able to make under the new legislation. So the only deductions that you will be able to make will be in respect of PAY and NIC, obviously subject to how you're operating if you are operating a trunk. That's quite a clear one. The other one that we may see is that there'll be a new obligation to make sure that you're paying out these tips, service charge and gratuities in the month following the month in which they're collected. Right. So they all have to be paid out. That's will create some change. And I think one of the other sort of operational challenges is around the focus on the requirement to allocate tips that are collected at each site and what that will mean under the new code of practice when it's issued. So there's obviously quite a bit in the new legislation, but I think just very clear and obvious areas of potential non-compliance would be those from the discussions that we've been having.
Okay, thank you. And Olivia, then, as an operator, where is the fear for you guys as to, you know, where could we fall foul of this new legislation without meaning to, obviously, but, you know, where do we really need to keep an eye on to make sure that we aren't doing something that previously was certainly legal, but you know, going forward will not be?
Yeah, I think we all take responsibility for this, for service charge, as a 5-star operator certainly do. So this is extra padding on how we commit to fairness. Where we fall foul is, you know, if there are any surprises in the guidelines. The one thing that we do need to consider more carefully and how fair it is agency staff. That's a bit of an unknown at the moment. So I think we need some firm direction on where we can take that. And that's the one thing that is a huge question mark that I find out there at the moment.
Thank you. So Andy, then from your point of view, what are we looking at with regards to agency staff? Have we had any indication of what that guidance is going to look like?
No, as we sit here right now, recording this webinar, we are still waiting on the code of practice from the Department of Business and Trade. It's promised and still not been delivered. It has to be imminent, but within that, we are told will be sort of practical commercial guidance about the agency workers element of this legislation. So all we really know at the moment is that the new act provides for agency staff to receive a share of tips in a fair manner and exactly the same as their employed counterparts that they work with. As Olivia alludes to, how we do that, what the nuances are of that, are yet to be explained. We do speak to some of the bigger agencies, and they're in exactly the same place. And in it, we answer one question and find we have another three from it. So it's really quite frustrating, and something that operators and agencies alike need to have some steer on.
Okay, Ben, from your experience, then where are operators going to have to really start looking? Where are they going to have to sort of almost have a checklist of, right, have we done X, Y, and Z? And then as part of that, you know, without naming any names, because we've already agreed we're not doing any naming or shaming on this podcast. Thank you very much. Can we also understand maybe some examples out there of issues that, again, might be okay-ish legally, not necessarily morally at the moment, but aren't going to be so once this legislation comes in?
Absolutely. I guess we're in kind of a unique position in the work that we do, because people do talk to us very openly about where they find themselves. And I think from our perspective, and where I think we need to be really clear, is we say something like non-compliant, and there's a sort of an accusation of badness about that, or a pejorative, and I really would love to dismiss that. Okay, I mean, hospitality businesses are tough to run, and I do not see any hospitality operators deliberately doing things that they know to be wrong. Quite the opposite, actually. What I see much more frequently when people talk to us about their situation is, over the course of what can be many years, a series of perfectly reasonable, good decisions made at the time in good faith sort of add up over time to suddenly find yourself in a situation where, looking at it in toto and sort of coldly again, one has to have some concerns. It's not where this new legislation is going to require us to be. You know, the examples that we do come across frequently is higher amounts of service bar charge being retained. Now, many have a policy to say the costs will be there, but obviously that varies over time, and those costs can creep up, and you end up in a situation where the amount of service charge being retained perhaps wouldn't be viewed as fair when looked at where we stand today. We also see a very frequent occurrence where service charge levels and trunk have been used to differentiate salaries amongst staff of different levels of seniority. And a real challenge for a lot of operators now is that progression and differentiation in salaries as people become more senior and grow, which we want them to do through the businesses. And sometimes that differentiation showing up in the amounts of trunk and service charge they receive. I think that's going to become more problematic. As I say, entirely innocently done and often very appropriate, but now standing back and looking at it, potentially a bit of a problem. I think the piece that perhaps is what came out very strongly in the debates in the House amongst the MPs was this sort of shift in view that service charge and trunk amounts are the property of the individuals who are involved in collecting them. And really, those are the people we're going to be asking about, does this feel fair to you? So, you know, I think the risks of getting it wrong for us, I think we've all seen the PR and press that can happen. And indeed, we all know that HMRC will start to enforce this, and there's the risk of fines. I think the one that perhaps is much more common and frequent is just that staff disengagement. It's one of the most challenging things, and one of the, if you like, one of the best ways to really disengage your staff is because there's been something in the tipping situation that to them at face value doesn't appear to feel right or fair. So, you know, I think this is a big shift. I'd encourage everyone to get some proper advice. I'd encourage everyone to really look at the whole piece around their business. Yes, it's a conversation about tips and trunk. That may have to involve your pricing. That may have to involve your salaries. That may have to involve many other parts of the business in terms of moving from where you are to where you're going to need to be under this new legislation.
In the bustling heart of hospitality, every service has its value. But beyond the impeccable service, there's a world where fairness and finance meet. We've helped businesses recover over £50 million in national insurance contributions.
From precision-focused trunk advice, masterful trunk master services to rigorous compliance checks, we're your ally in the tipping ecosystem.
And because we believe in a world where every penny and every principle counts, here's our offer to you.
Mention Fair Tips 1 when reaching out, and you'll get an exclusive hour of free consultation with Andy Hammond. With the Trunk Advisor, it's more than just tipping. It's about transforming the way hospitality thrives. The Trunk Advisor, where every tip leads to a greater journey.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Ben, that you just mentioned about, staff essentially being happy, and if you're in any job you work across the world in any industry, if you don't feel like you're being valued and remunerated for what you do, then you're not going to be happy. And we've discussed, this is episode 4. We've discussed before how important it is to staff retention, to attracting new staff. So we need to look at it on a real positive from that point of view. One question I do have, and I from where I sit, I think this is a bit of scaremongering. I'm not sure that we actually see much of this in our industry, but we do hear those sort of horror stories or those old wives' tales, whatever you want to call them, about service charges and tipping being taken away from the teams if they have had a breakage, if they've had somebody walk out without paying, etc. Do we think that is actually an issue in our industry? Or, as I say, is that something that's maybe been passed down over the years that is no longer really a problem? Ben, do you want to come back to your thoughts on that?
It certainly happens. It does happen. And again, I really want to stress that this often comes from a place of really good intention in terms of wanting to motivate a whole team to fall into line with the standards that we need to uphold, wanting to have a team who are really motivated in the same direction as the business itself. So I think it genuinely comes from a positive place. Unfortunately, it's only when one stands in a slightly different place and looks at it, you go, oh, hang on a sec. That isn't something that is actually fair in terms of what this money is and what it truly represents, which is discretionary amounts that your customers would like to pass to your staff. That's what this is. And really, it's actually not a change in this legislation. It's always been the case that employers, if they want to benefit from the national insurance exemptions, employers cannot be involved or influence the decisions about who gets what. And in terms of the stories that I've heard, I think often when you hear about HMRC actually taking action, really it feels like, and Andy and perhaps Charlie and Olivia would have more experience here, but it feels like that's often where HMRC will come down quite strictly, is when they are seeing amounts of trunk being used in a way that is very clearly being influenced and directed by the business and by its owners. Again, it disrupts the principle. These things cease to be discretionary amounts passed by customers to be passed on to staff and start to be just a part of the reward and remuneration that the employer is directing. And that's where, again, frequently HMRC will not go and pursue those individual employees for anything that has not been paid. They will pursue the employer. So it can become quite serious and it can be quite shocking. I've heard of amounts, well into 6 figures that even relatively mid-sized operators have had to confront when it's been determined it's wrong. And it can be very innocent. A story of a restaurateur I know who purely coincidentally made his employed trunk master, who'd been a trunk master for many years, actually made her an officer of the company. It wasn't picked up, and HMRC held that up as invalidating the entire trunk because suddenly the trunk master was an officer of the company. So it can even be purely administrative pieces. So I guess it goes back to that thing. You need an Andy in your life, in my view. You need a bit of Andy Hammond to keep you straight and narrow here.
Okay, well, let's bring a little bit more of Andy back into our lives then. Andy, talk to us about at-risk operators. What do they need to be looking at to avoid the sort of pitfalls of exactly what we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, I think as Ben suggests, it's a case of knowing what's actually happening. And interestingly enough, I was speaking to a new client just yesterday, and his view was, I need to know what I don't know, and that's quite common. Directors, business owners have a view of how their trunk operates. Some of them will even say, "I don't know how it operates," which is quite scary to hear. But it's understanding what have you got, and is it actually going to meet the conditions of this legislation? So the legislation is all around compliance and meeting the conditions that have been set by the government. I think act now is definitely a decent piece of advice. The clock is really ticking. I think we are rapidly going into the end of the year. When we hit January, I think a lot of people are going to suddenly realize, we've only got a matter of months now. It is reality. It's really happening. It's not something that's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months away that it used to be. And look at what you've got. Do some research. Even if it's internal, check it out, and audit what you've got. Ask the trunk master what's happening. Engage with them. As an employer, you are a stakeholder in the whole piece anyway. Again, as Ben says, if you get it wrong, the HMRC will come to the employer, not the trunk master. It's the employer that's getting the checkbook out to write a large check for national insurance arrears. If HMRC can pin that on them, so you have a valid interest to know that your trunk, although it needs to be independent, you need to know that it's compliant. So look at it now. Use the time now, and if you're unsure, seek advice, speak to your peers, speak to other people in the business that may have more experience historically of running trunks, or come out to professional advisors like Charlie and myself, and get a third party opinion of it, and at least you can sleep easy at night, even if that opinion is you're doing okay, everything's as it should be. That's worth its weight in anybody's book. So that would be my advice.
Okay, thank you. And I've heard the phrase or the HMRC far too many times in that little answer. So I'm going to go on to something a little bit more in depth with regards to finances. Olivia, we obviously, the idea of this legislation means that we've got to learn how do we balance sort of fair tipping practices and financial viability. We said earlier we may well have to start looking at pricing. There's all sorts of areas that we're going to have to review within operator businesses. Have you had any thoughts about what that looks like specifically for your hotel?
Well, we've actually recently introduced the service charge on bedrooms. So I think hotels are quite, our customers are certainly used to that now. We haven't looked at pricing as such because it's so competitive out there. You've got to get the business, and pricing is important from that point of view. We have thought about, let's see what everybody else is charging as a percentage of service charge, but we haven't actually changed anything yet. So that would be our next step. Let's see, are we the same as others? And that will be what the customer expects. As far as pricing on our menu goes, we have to address sometimes the costs on that side. And salaries are going up as well. So London living wage is going up 10%.
Yeah.
Hey you, did you know that TiPJAR is 100% compliant with the new legislation? Well, we are. We can do pretty much anything. Tips, trunk, you name it. Not only that, but your staff are going to get their money 6 times faster than a traditional method. No national insurance contributions for you, full transparency for all of your staff, and absolutely no more administrative headaches. Find out more today.
Yeah, there's a lot to look at, unfortunately, for the industry. Well, there always is, isn't there? There's always a lot going on, but it does seem at the moment that we've got a lot of plates spinning. Charlie, I'm intrigued to know what effect you believe this legislation might have on future hospitality legislation, whether you see this as being a bit of a gateway to more guidance coming in when it comes to sort of compliance, and what we can and can't do within the industry. Any thoughts on that at all?
I think it's obviously there's a bit of a perfect storm, unfortunately, because there is this legislation. We've got, as Olivia was mentioning, we've got the national minimum wage, which will continue to rise. It is already tabled to go. We know it's going to go up to at least £11. The Chancellor said that. We anticipate it might even rise higher than that. So there's that. We've got new holiday pay legislation, which these all impact every employer, but specifically will have an impact on this industry as well. So we've got new holiday pay legislation, which is just been published, will take effect from next year. So I think my thoughts are, I don't think specifically this industry in terms of expecting new employment legislation, but I think we are seeing quite a lot of new legislation in the employment space generally, which employers in leisure and hospitality will need to understand how it impacts them. We've got new legislation concerning casual workers coming in next year and their right to request predictable patterns of work. Obviously, we're keeping, looking forward to the future, and you think about, well, what might happen if there's a change of government, and potentially what might happen as a consequence there as well. So I think, as an employment lawyer, there is always change. We always get cases which suddenly throw up, how did that happen? And so it's just more generally there will be things to be aware of. But I think this one in particular, I can see, obviously there is a concern there around, well, how will it impact us, and what do we need to do to get ready for it? And I totally agree with Andy that it is really about understanding what it is that you're doing now, because the conversations that we have with clients is, and they might have a tronc in some sites and they might not have troncs in others, and they just don't know what's going on. And it's about understanding what is happening across the whole site before you then start, okay, well, how then do we build our strategy around how, what are we going to do to comply, but also to make sure that operationally it works for us as an organization.
And do you think, Charlie, that there will be any kind of unofficial grace period, i.e., if you're found to be doing something that isn't quite right for the legislation within the first couple of months or weeks or whatever, that they may well go easy on you? Or do you think that this is pretty much a closed and shut situation? It's just closed and shut?
It's a good point. It's a good point, because at the moment, obviously, all we've got the act is in force, but only sort of the bit that says it's going to happen and there's going to be a code of practice. There is power for the Secretary of State to give themselves more time to allow people to get up to speed with the code of practice. But yeah, at the moment, we are anticipating May 2024 being the go live date. But one would hope that this code of practice is published promptly. And yes, that there is some element of, or some period of in which operators can understand what it's saying and then have a chance to implement it. So you'd hope there would be, but there's no guarantees of that.
Okay, thank you. Ben, one last question for you from me. We had, you said very early on in this conversation that, that generally it's through no fault of anybody's own when a situation occurs, which isn't really sitting in the right compliance bucket, so to speak. We have some sort of common issues that come up, and certain sort of maybe common tribunals that you see. How are we going to avoid being in that situation when we haven't even got the guidance yet, and it's supposed to be coming in May 2024? I mean, we've, everybody has said, Andy's saying sort of act now, ask for help now, but what are the common areas that you could see that might not go to plan for operators?
I think I completely agree with Charlie in terms of the approach. We're yet to see the approach that HMRC are going to take. I'd like to think HMRC will take the approach of their role here is to help us be compliant and get it right. And I guess what I'd be saying to operators is you probably don't want to wait for that to happen before you start to look at this, because some of these changes are bigger than simply oh, let's make sure the trunk's okay. It is likely, based on a lot of what we're seeing out there in the market and historic practice, those changes are going to be more comprehensive. You will probably need a Charlie because you may be needing to look at employment contracts. You will need an Andy because you're going to be looking at distribution and what fair might mean in the context of your business. So what I would say is, yes, I think the code of conduct will clarify some aspects. However, the act is the act. And in our connections with the individuals who are responsible for the code of conduct, the act is the act. The words on the paper cannot change. And some of the points that Charlie and Andy made earlier on, these are not going to be different. So service charges and tips collected in a place being distributed in that place, 100% being paid out in the month subsequent to that which is collected. Those things we know are going to be there, right? And my argument would be those are enough to get going now, because those are the basics. Yes, we've got the issue that Olivia raised around agency workers. I think we're all very confused exactly how that's expected to work. But there are some fundamentals here. And our honest guidance or a suggestion to anyone who's running a business in this space is you know, look at some of these bigger changes now, because you don't want having to be making these changes very quickly without time, because you've got someone breathing down your neck, be that a journalist, be that HMRC, be that a vocal team member making threats. Don't wait for there to be a gun against your head. Do this now, do it in a methodical way, do it in a strategic way that will mean that, you know, your business is in a good space as and when things start to change next year. And again, I'm sure, Charlie, Olivia, making this sort of change in businesses takes time. In my experience, I'm sure you've seen the same thing. You don't want to be imposing this on people overnight. You need that consultation, engagement, communication to take your team with you on that journey, and ultimately get to where you need to be smoothly and professionally and sensibly. So I think you look at the big stuff now. Yes, there's areas of vagueness. They will come in the code of conduct, but don't use the code of conduct as an excuse to say, oh, no, we're going to wait, because the legislation is the legislation and it ain't going to change.
Yeah, agreed. Olivia, I'd like to ask you a question from an operator standpoint. Have you had conversations with your teams, and how are they reacting to the new legislation? You know, are the teams sort of, you know, yippee, I'm now going to get, you know, more of the service charge, more of the tips, or it's going to make a big difference to me? You know, is there any kind of, you know, word on the street, so to speak, from the teams within hospitality that you're hearing about this trunk? Because we talk a lot about what it means for head office, we talk a lot about what it means for the industry as a whole, but I'd love to know whether the teams on the ground in our pubs, bars, restaurants, etc., hotels, what they're thinking about it.
Well, I have to say nobody's come to me to ask any questions, but I think this could mean one of two things. A, there's no loud-spoken person who's like, oh, what's going on here? Or the second, which is more likely, is that our teams can see what tips and trunks that we're actually collecting. And they have an understanding when they see their payslip what's going out as well. So I would say that that tells me that we're acting fairly. So it could be that they're just not aware that there's a big change coming, but actually it's spoken about everywhere. So we have an open door policy if anybody wants to ask. But I also know that they know what's in the pot, and they know what they get, and they talk to each other as well. So there's a lot of transparency there. You know, our night auditor audits it.
So for the operators that do have that transparency, they're probably not hearing so much from their teams, because their teams are a little bit like, well, we already know what's going on there. So, you know, it's good for the industry, but it's not something that's really sat front of mind for me, because I feel I'm being remunerated fairly. Andy, I want to finish with you, because I think that we've had, you know, over these 4 episodes, we've had a lot of conversation about the fact that we are still a little bit in the dark at the moment. We've already spoken about, you know, we need to act now, stay informed, etc. Anyone that was watching this, Andy, that is literally sat there, you know, close to tears thinking, what on earth am I going to do? where, other than obviously your good self and Charlie, where should they be looking to find the information that they need to make sure that they end up on the right side of this?
Okay, so naturally, the legislation is available through the .gov website. There are hundreds and hundreds of commentators that have explained it in more lay terms. I would just get online and do some research. I think I mentioned earlier as well, hospitality is a very close knit community. Speak to your peers. If you're an FD, speak to your FD community. If you're a people director, speak to your people director community. They're there. They're bound to be different viewpoints, of course, but you'll definitely find those that have already got themselves in a good position or been through that journey to get themselves to a good position. And I think having that supportive advice, that practical advice, is worth its weight in gold. You can read the legislation, but it's almost preempting what the code of practice hopefully will say. But for getting it from your peers, how have you found it? What pitfalls did you come across? How did you get around this idea? You probably might even bring ideas to them that might they might reflect back to you and go, we haven't thought about that one. Good point. So it works both ways, right? So that's what I would do. But again, don't sit back on your laurels and do nothing. Don't put your head in the bucket of sand. The legislation's there. It's coming. All right. It may have a slight delay to it. Who knows? But again, as Ben said, it ain't changing. We know what we know. So don't ignore it. If you do, at your peril. So don't be the one on the front page of the Evening Standard in the summer, unless you really want the bad press and reputation.
Yeah, the fact is there is such a thing as bad PR, isn't there? And that is exactly where we can end up if we don't get compliant and get ourselves together with this legislation. Thank you so much. I think that what we've learned from today is that we need HMRC to help us to be compliant rather than to be seen as that punishing body. It's more about how can we get it right? How can they help us? I think everybody out there needs to totally stay informed. We need to act now. I think that has been a theme that has been coming through all four of the five Fair Tips talks. One day I'm definitely going to get that wrong, possibly the last one. Ask for help. Don't underestimate how important this is. And also, let's really lean into that hospitality community that our industry is so well known for, and help each other to get to the point that we need to be with this legislation. So thank you so much for joining me, Andy, Olivia, Charlie, and Ben. This has been episode 4 of Fair Tips Talks, and I will see you for the 5th and final one.
What an awesome episode. Next time, our final episode, episode 5, we'll be talking all about the code of practice, if it ever comes out. Still have any burning questions? Well, that's no problem. Tweet us at TiPJAR_tweets, or use this QR code to find us on LinkedIn. Thanks so much.